Hello, and welcome back to the Fabric of Industry podcast, episode 13. What is the secondary sector? I am your host, Adam Grange. We have finally made it after 12 episodes, the exciting introduction of my favorite sector of industry, the secondary sector. In this episode, we will be discussing what the secondary sector accomplishes, its major subsectors, and prominent industries within. We will also discuss why the secondary sector is important, and then lay a sort of roadmap for navigating the secondary sector in the episodes to come. And I do apologize for the several month break from the last episode. This one took longer than expected, and then I've also had quite a bit of school going on, and just general summer stuff, a lot of other stuff going on. So I know we took a break in last fall as well, so hopefully this will be our only sort of long break this year, and we're going to try and get back to more of a schedule, whatever that actually means for us. But we will make a start with this episode on the comeback, and we've got much to get through, and it is all exciting, so let's make a start. So let's answer the question, what is the secondary sector first? This is the sector where things get made, to put it simply. If you recall back to our episodes on the primary sector, it was concerned with the extraction of raw materials from the earth. These are in no particular order of importance, and not all of them, but the important ones: wood, food, that is timber or lumber, depending on what English-speaking country you are from, food and fish, water, gas, oil, minerals, metals, rocks. These feed straight into the secondary sector, although not always, but most primary sector products, those I just listed, will end up in some industry in the secondary sector. The secondary sector generally includes manufacturing, construction, and especially today, due to urbanization across the world, electricity, that is water, food supply, gas supply. The means of supplying those things I just mentioned deal with the tertiary sector, because those are services. Think of power companies, transportation of food, things like that. But there needs to be a producer of these things. Generally, raw materials are processed or produced in some way in the secondary sector before they reach the tertiary sector and then reach consumers. So that is our key idea here: production. Think extraction for the primary sector and production for the secondary sector, and service for the tertiary, but we will get into that in due time, though fair warning, I will mention the tertiary sector while discussing the secondary fairly frequently, so it is good to have an idea of what the tertiary is, though it is very broad. So let's break down each of the major subsectors I listed. We will start with, that is, manufacturing, construction, and utilities. So we will start with manufacturing, and it's probably the largest and most well-known aspect of the secondary sector. When people think of, things being made, they think of manufacturing in some way. Manufacturing is broad. It encompasses simple light manufacturing with manual labor to extensive light manufacturing with machines, although usually smaller machines than heavy manufacturing, but then it extends to heavy manufacturing involving both and everything in between. But we'll break it down a little later into just light and heavy manufacturing, so we won't complicate that too much. Just think of it also as a spectrum, but somewhere in the middle, light manufacturing becomes heavy manufacturing, and I'll explain that in a bit. There are generally considered to be 3 tiers in manufacturing. If you could guess, they are creatively named Tier 3, Tier 2, and Tier 1. Tier 3 involves the direct intake of raw materials, turning them into some usable form, usually into basic materials or simple parts. This could include steel production, plastic pellet formation, basic chemicals, or even glass. Usually the manufactured goods in Tier 3 are not ready for use by consumers. You may think, well, people buy steel and glass, but most of these materials go into Tier 2 or into construction, which we will get into next. Tier 2 involves actual component manufacturing. Additional refinement is added here and will result in things like electronic circuits, woven fabrics, machine parts, or even something like tires, car tires, rubber tires. Think going with tires here. Think raw rubber goes into from the primary sector goes into tier 3 manufacturing, and comes out as tire rubber. That then goes to the specific rubber they use to make tires, and then that goes to tier 2 manufacturing to be made into tires. Tier 2 products are still usually not final products for consumers, but are more specialized and result in more advanced parts. Tier 1 manufacturers are the closest to consumers, as Tier 1 involves final product assembly. If something isn't sold to consumers from the previous tiers, it will be made into something that can be sold here. And most of the manufactured things you buy at the store or online or see anywhere are from Tier 1. This can be car assembly, smartphones and other devices, appliances, or even tires once they have gone through Tier 3 and have been prepared to actually be used on a vehicle. Tier 3, just to sum it up, Tier 3 will make a basic part. Tier 2 will take basic parts and build them into a machine part, an advanced part. And Tier 1 will take machine parts and build them into a car, or something like that. Now, there is also a distinction between heavy manufacturing and light manufacturing, like I mentioned right when we started explaining manufacturing. Most countries usually have a more heavy or a more light-focused manufacturing economy, because the capital required for each are quite different. Heavy manufacturing is, as it sounds, focused on large manufacturing, usually heavy things, although that's not why it's called heavy manufacturing. Not necessarily bulk versus non-bulk things, but large products, cars and planes, heavy machinery like turbines. The capital investment required for heavy manufactured goods is much higher than the capital required for most light manufacturing. As I said, it's more of a spectrum, but we can break it up pretty well. This is because most large goods require large spaces to be built, many more materials, other heavy machinery, and specialized transportation. Think like a large shipyard making all those individual parts for a massive cargo ship. That's heavy manufacturing. That's, the highest end of heavy manufacturing, but you can think of it like that. On the other hand, light manufacturing is much more labor intensive, meaning it is focused on humans more so and not gigantic expensive machinery. Not that there are not high costs to employment, but the initial capital investments for heavy manufacturing are much higher. Heavy manufacturing also includes raw industrial materials. This is distinct from raw materials from the earth from the primary sector, because the industrial materials are manufactured. So think steel beams from tier 3 manufacturing, concrete, processed oil. Again, the capital, a lot of those things go into construction, of course. And again, the capital investment required to manufacture steel is much higher than that of textiles, because the equipment required is that much more expensive, among all the other capital. While China, just to point out probably the most well-known manufacturing country, China is known for a lot of light manufacturing. It's generally the country most well-known for heavy manufacturing, though. For example, a ridiculous 54% of steel production came from China in 2023. This is different from exported steel because China uses a ridiculous amount of the steel it produces as well, just domestically. But for manufacturing purposes, we look at the amount produced. Germany is also a well-known country for its advanced machinery industries and automotive as well. The United States is probably most well-known for its defense industries in terms of heavy manufacturing, among quite a few others. And Russia is quite prominent with raw industrial materials like processed oil and gas and various metals. Light manufacturing is tailored more to the individual consumer, instead of think like companies is more of what, or even countries, governments, is what heavy manufacturing is usually going to be selling to. Light manufacturing is tailored to the individual consumer, which is perhaps why we tend to think China focuses more on this. As I stated earlier, light manufacturing requires much less capital investment and is more labor intensive, producing finished consumer goods. Things like clothing, electronics, Food processing is a big light manufacturing industry. Household goods like decoration or furniture. And yes, while China does do a lot of this in addition to the prominent heavy manufacturing, other countries have a much higher focus on light manufacturing. Typically, as a country becomes more industrialized and developed, heavy manufacturing will start to replace light manufacturing as the workforce moves toward the tertiary sector and machinery replaces a lot of the manual labor. So think of countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh with their large textile industries, Taiwan with the consumer electronics industries, and perhaps Mexico with the large amount of assembly plants that feed into the US economy, into more heavy industries, heavy manufacturing industries. And I mentioned food processing a bit ago as a key industry here, and that perfectly exemplifies a major market difference between heavy and light manufacturing. Typically, heavy manufactured goods are manufactured to be sold to and exported somewhere else than the origin country. That is commonly opposite for light manufactured goods. While there is a lot of nuance there, because if you look at the tag on your shirt, there's a good chance it says made in Bangladesh or something of the like. Food processing is especially true of a light manufacturing industry because being used. The food is being used primarily for the country of origin and then for export second. Because the country needs to generally try and feed itself before it sells that off. Although again, nuance there, but that's generally how it works. This is because light manufacturing is typically located near the markets it serves, light manufacturing industries, versus heavy manufacturing, which is more often located near natural resources. Again, because you need a lot of them and you're building usually huge things or bulk industrial materials. For example, an airplane made in the United States may be used in the United States, but it will probably be sold to other countries, with the United States making up for over a quarter of global aerospace exports. But food made in the United States will typically be placed on shelves in the United States first, and then exported second. Again, nuance since agriculture exports account for about 10% of the total United States exports, but that is mostly in soybeans, which are not really used for humans' consumption as much as livestock. Anyway, the key idea here is heavy manufacturing is large things or industrial materials usually made for export, while light manufacturing consists of labor-intensive goods being made for export primarily, like electronics, but also a lot of the time for local markets. Um, Again, think food or water. So again, the key idea, a bit nuanced there, but as I said in the beginning, it's a spectrum. But I think hopefully you can get kind of a clear idea of the differences between the two. We gotta categorize stuff in some way. Also, many more developed countries are more heavily involved in heavy manufacturing, while more less developed countries are focused on light manufacturing due to the difference between physical capital investment and labor, respectively. Physical capital investment for heavy and labor for light. Now, for our purposes, I am also going to separate and go into more detail on the raw material processing and refining bit of heavy manufacturing. So keep in mind, it is generally part of heavy manufacturing, but it is important for us to separate it into its own category, I think. We'll have a lot of episodes going on both of these things, so again, just further categorization kind of keeps it, you know, easier to memorize in your mind or remember and learn this information. Materials processing involves, which is what I'll call it involves taking raw materials and refining it into a usable material, usually for another industry such as construction, which we will segue into next. A lot of the time, processing is also a middle ground between the primary raw materials and a finished consumer product still made in the secondary sector, just in a different tier. For example, silicon wafers for computer processors. The materials we probably think of right away are things like stone and sand into concrete, and various metals like iron ore into an actual usable product like steel. But included here is food processing, like milk into cheese or wheat into flour, and especially wood, so timber into lumber, And again, anecdotally, I believe I mentioned this in episode 2 on forestry, but I think not all English-speaking countries call the finished product lumber. I think some places refer to the finished wood as timber, while in the United States we call the actual felled tree timber. That's why we yell out timber. I don't actually know if that happens. I've never cut down trees before, but just think of a cut down tree into a cut length of wood for construction or something like that. So just we're going to refer to it as lumber in this podcast. Now, all of those specific examples I listed are involved in the processing part of all this. There are many more materials that are instead refined. So there's processing and then there's refining, and these are actually two separate industrial terms. And refined products are usually things like stone and metal. So processing involves processes like cleaning, cutting, sorting, grinding, mixing, or any of the various processes involved in turning raw food into something for human consumption, like baking bread. Refining involves processes with chemical reactions, usually through heat or separation techniques like distillation, which of course brings to mind crude oil turning into gasoline or bitumen or any of the other many petrochemicals we will go over in depth in the future. There is also ore refining, like magnetite into iron and bauxite into aluminum. And there are even some food processes here, like raw sugar into refined sugar, because the processes involved are more alike to refining techniques than raw processing techniques. Processing and refining are incredibly important because most of the raw materials derived from the primary sector are not usable in most cases. So here they are made usable for manufacturing, which in turn supports entire industries downstream, even beyond the secondary sector. And of course, processing or refining a material adds value to said material, supporting economies of scale in these industries. When we go over various industries in processing and refining, I will detail the processes since I kind of just listed them off, like cleaning, cutting, sorting, all that stuff. I will detail those processes involved for that specific industry because I think if I list them all here, I'm just going to have to repeat them for whatever specific industry I go over. So it'll be better to, think of this process and then be like, oh yeah, well that's how that works because that's how it works in this specific industry. That now brings us to discussing construction. Construction is sort of the opposite to manufacturing. Both build things, yes, but manufactured goods are able to be transported and are not designed to be permanent, while construction involves building physical structures, and infrastructure especially, that are designed to stay. They're designed to be permanent. Fixed, long-lasting assets and capital like roads, utilities, and buildings. There are three major types of construction, and parenthetically, this is from an economic point of view. I do not know if contractors or construction companies would actually agree with these categories, but anyway, they are residential, commercial, and infrastructure. Residential construction is for residents, for living spaces, places people live, like houses, apartments, condominiums. Commercial construction is a bit more broad and complex, but think of things like office buildings, warehouses, malls, schools, hospitals, usually large buildings used for things other than living, and very often for working. The third category is infrastructure and is maybe the most broad. These are those physical structures that provide services to people but aren't really buildings in the sense of being able to enter them, having rooms and hallways and whatnot a lot of the time. Roads are probably the quintessential example of infrastructure, but it includes things from bridges and dams to airports to power grids, especially. So, yes, sometimes they are buildings. The main reason for the distinction between an airport being infrastructure and like a hospital being commercial is that infrastructure is typically government funded and critical for economic development. Airports are most often government funded and are critical for economic development because they move people and goods around and connect countries. Hospitals can be government funded, especially if they are large and depending on the healthcare in your country, but are not always, and they are key here is they are not critical for economic development. Are they important? Yes, of course. Do they have an impact on economies? Yes, of course. But they are not directly integral to developing an economy. While if your country lacks a major airport, it will be, or many major airports, it will be very difficult to be involved in global trade and moving people to and from your country. Hopefully, especially if you're landlocked, of course. So hopefully that makes that distinction clear. Now, and of course there are other examples, but those are probably the two best and easiest to think of. The reason I spoke about processing and refining first is because construction relies almost entirely on processed and refined materials. Neither your airport or your hospital are being built without concrete and steel, or glass, or plastic, or wood, or pretty much anything else you see when you look at any physical structure. A key distinction between construction and manufacturing is that construction is project based, meaning each job is unique. Yes, they make the same things, but one apartment building is going to be different from the next apartment building in many different ways, even though they're both apartment buildings and they both essentially do the same thing. Manufacturing typically involves making the same things over and over and over again in a factory, a facility, or a warehouse. Construction projects are also a key driver of economic growth because they create a lot of jobs and create capital to be used directly for economic growth, and are also heavily tied to economic booms, meaning projects greatly increase when economies are doing well. Or they are used as a kickstarter for economies. So think about all of the, if you are familiar with United States history, just in general, think about all of the construction projects that were government funded and being kickstarted all across the country in response to the Great Depression. Did it solve the Great Depression? Not entirely, but that's a historical thing to get into, and we're not going to do that. Just, for our purposes, yes, they are used. Construction projects are used by governments to kickstart economic development, and sometimes it is also just a consequence of economic development. Manufacturing, of course, ebbs and flows with economic booms and busts, but is not impacted as heavily and is more of a steady stream due to the nature of manufacturing. Now onto the final subsector, as this one is not always directly included in the secondary sector because the industry as a whole is both secondary and tertiary, but as I outlined at the beginning of this episode, I consider utility production as secondary and utility distribution as tertiary. So they go hand in hand, but one comes before the other, as with all secondary into tertiary industries. So our last subsector is, of course, utilities, but specifically utility production. And we're going to have a lot of episodes on utility production, especially energy production. Utilities are grouped into yet another three categories. We love our three categories. Those are electricity, water, which included is wastewater, so sewage, and natural gas, which can be considered heating most often. Electricity, as I said, will become the source of a long series of episodes I have planned, but for now, we will give a generalization. Electricity is generated from a lot of sources, a lot of different sources, with the most common around the world being coal and natural gas, which parenthetically is different from heating natural gas. And then you also have nuclear, depending on the country a lot of the time, hydroelectric, wind, solar, and geothermal. Just mentioning those there makes me excited for the future. Those will be a lot of episodes for all of those. Electricity is transmitted through power grids, which are a major type of infrastructure in pretty much every country. I'm sure it goes without saying, the modern world does not exist without electricity. Everything we do counts on the reliable production and subsequent transmission of electricity. That, of course, does not mean water is not an important utility as well, since people do not exist without water, and generally there are too many people in a city for everyone to go to a well, and of course that just also doesn't make sense for a lot of different reasons. Though mostly what we think of as water in terms of the utility is the tap in our homes, but water production though, and that's transmission, right, is the actual tap coming to your house, and then you pay the bill to your water company or whatever it is. But again, water production, though that sounds a little weird, is much broader than just you know producing the water to give to that utility company. Water all around the world is treated and purified before being distributed. This counts for bottled water at a store too, but that fits into manufacturing, into food processing, and not utility. The vast majority of water, in terms of utility, is not really used for drinking. It's used for washing clothes and dishes. It's used in as many industrial applications as you can think, pretty much every single one that exists. It's used widely in construction as well. And all that water has to be treated before use. It's just not necessarily to a quality for drinking. If you ever see, one of those big tankers of water on a cleared construction site, and it says not potable water, or not for drinking or whatever, it's still been treated. And then a lot of that water that doesn't just evaporate is run through sewer systems. That wastewater is then collected and then treated again before being returned to the environment, and then collected again, but not the same water. It's a, sort of a human water cycle, perhaps. Not nearly on as grand of a scale as the real water cycle. The third utility here is natural gas, and that is natural gas, again, that isn't used for energy production. Most of it is burned for heating purposes, whether that be for cooking, industrial heating, or actual home heating. Again, you pay your gas bill, especially that goes up in the winter. Utilities are, in general, are things we rely on every day in the modern world. The reason I am including them here, although parenthetically I will have utility transmission in the tertiary sector too, as I've mentioned, is because of the transformation of natural resources. For electricity, we get coal or gas or uranium, although refined uranium, so it's even additionally processed. But all of those are turned into a product usable for people. People don't really use coal or natural gas or refined uranium for things except for maybe science projects. But when when coal is burned, it's turned into a quote-unquote product that is usable by people, that is electricity. Well, heat that's then turned into electricity. Now, electricity isn't physically a product. Again, that's why I was saying quote-unquote product. It's not something we can grasp. It's not a physical thing, right? But in economical terms, it is certainly a product. Raw water is processed into clean water, and natural gas is, well, it's just burned, but it is captured for heating. It's just burned. Same thing for energy production, but for heating specifically, it's just burned. But it is captured as a raw resource first, and then produced into heat or gas for cooking, or any of the other many uses of methane, which is natural gas. And it is processed slightly. It's not like you could just, find a natural gas well into your house or something and then use that for your gas. There is a reason besides safety reasons, there's another reason it goes through utility companies and production. Utilities also require large industrial systems and infrastructure. A lot of the time, it's government funded, or it's run by large monopoly type companies that are heavily subsidized, so again, mostly government funded. The main reason why the distinction is a bit blurry here is between purely secondary or tertiary, is because physical products aren't created. I suppose with the exception of water. But then again, water's not even really created, it's just treated. But even then, these are products that can only provide services to people because they aren't technically physical, and services are what the tertiary sector deals with. So, those products are sold to tertiary sector service industries, like utility transmission companies. But I think, and then transmitted to your home or business or whatever it may be. But I think it can be split into utility production for the secondary sector and utility transmission for the tertiary sector, and I think it makes a lot of sense for us. Both are very interesting, excuse me, I was talking too fast there, and both require us to talk about them. I am just electing to split it up. I've mentioned some of the prominent and well-known industries within the secondary sector while going over its subsectors, but let's compile sort of a list here. I'm going to list standout industries that have the largest economic impact, trade impact, and impact on everyday lives around the world. The automotive industry has become especially important worldwide over the last 50 years or so, even the last 100 years, but more globally, I suppose more the last 50 years. This, of course, includes consumer vehicles like sedans or pickup trucks, which even outside the US are becoming increasingly reliant on for transportation as countries get richer and people are able to afford their own vehicles. The automotive industry, however, includes all the commercial vehicles we may forget about. That is, trucks that transport goods to businesses and homes across the globe, real trucks, not your Chevy pickup truck. The largest automotive players are Germany, the United States, Japan, South Korea, and China in no particular order. A lot of the time, hand in hand with helping the automotive industry function is the petroleum industry. But as broad of an industry as it is, we will have to keep our discussion here brief. Don't worry. As I've mentioned, we have a lot of episodes, big chunk of episodes of those coming in the future. Oil refining and petrochemicals are the main sub-industries, and outside of producing gasoline and other fuels, plastic is one of the world's most produced commodities, and that of course comes from petroleum. It is, however, extremely capital intensive and requires either a rich country or significant investment from one. Saudi Arabia is probably the first country that comes to mind, and for good reason, but Russia is a giant as well, and of course the United States is up there as the largest oil producer worldwide, at least for now. That's only become recently because of fracking techniques, which most countries don't use. Electronics, specifically, on the semiconductor industry here, is perhaps the most important now and provides the largest impact on everyday life today. The semiconductor industry can be summed up in by producing computer chips. That's mostly pretty much what it does. Though I dislike that term, computer chips, but we will delve into that in its own episode. China, Taiwan, South Korea, and of course the United States are all major players there. Metal production, especially steel, is of course quite prominent. As most modern construction relies on steel and other metals, it is one of the backbones of industrial economies, and while we may feel the impact of semiconductors more, that doesn't mean steel is diminishing in power. As I mentioned earlier, China produces by far the most steel, but produces a lot of other metals as well, like aluminum. Russia and India are also major players here. Everyone wears clothes, hopefully, so perhaps we don't think about the impact of the textile and the apparel industries too much, but it is one of the most important light manufacturing industries and very important for developing countries such as Bangladesh, Vietnam, and India. And China is once again a major player here. And finally, I'll mention food processing, and not just packaged foods, but beverage production, including drinking water, meat processing, dairy processing, and the like. And this is one of those industries found in nearly every country, and a larger industries in most countries at that, making it fairly unique. Although everyone needs to eat, so it probably doesn't come as a surprise. But very few countries produce more than they actually consume, which is known as food independence. And so major countries here include the United States, Brazil, and China in terms of exporting and the amount of food actually produced. And that's not just raw food, but food actually processed. I am actually rather excited to go over food processing later, and I think I'll do a short series covering food processing itself, but also sort of the dark side we tend not to, or maybe try not to think about. Think about maybe like Super Size Me, the movie, if you know what that is. Not quite like that, but, more of the dark side of food processing. As well as what food independence actually is, since it is quite important, and which countries are truly food independent. And spoiler, there is technically only one. as far as I remember. But there are more who are food independent. But we'll discuss all that in a future episode. Now, let's move on to discussing why the secondary sector is so important. Much of this is probably obvious, but I think it's good to really hammer it in. This sort of goes over a lot of concepts more in detail that we've been over in some of our previous general economics episodes. The key here is that the secondary sector is what actually transforms the raw materials in the world into the world around us, the world we actually experience. That is your home, your job, your transportation, your food, and pretty much everything else you interact with. Perhaps we don't always think about it like that because it is the tertiary sector through the services it provides that actually deliver the world to us, but it is the secondary sector that creates it for us. And of course, the primary sector that acts as the foundation, but we're talking about the secondary sector here. I have created a list of what are the most important aspects of the secondary sector, or at least what I think, so let's go over those now. The first is that the secondary sector actually adds value to the raw resources the Earth provides. I mentioned that a bit earlier. This is not just economic value, but intrinsic perceived value by humans as well, which often go hand in hand, but they are a bit different. Iron ore, for example, is not very useful in basically any way, but steel? Well, steel is just about the most useful material there is. Well, at least I think so. I love steel, and we will be getting into steel heavily in the future. But in terms of economics, this is called value-added production. This is what makes the secondary sector actually profitable, meaning industries and economies can actually grow. If there was nothing in it for steel producers, then they wouldn't produce steel. And what a strange world that would be where iron ore is useful and steel is not. Of course, still, then iron ore will just be not very useful. The second is job creation, where millions and millions of jobs exist and are created through the secondary sector. This is not a particularly unique aspect, as all 5 sectors can claim they create jobs, but the most important thing about the secondary sector jobs is that wages are typically higher than in the primary sector due to the value-added production process, and this helps to create middle classes in countries, in economies, especially before moving to a post-industrial society where services start to replace that. The third one is, and I think I've mentioned that sort of flow in a previous economics episode. The third one here is perhaps the most important one, and that is that the secondary sector drives economic growth. The primary sector has to exist somewhere, but it isn't what drives the economic growth. Again, it's the foundation. It just supplies what is physically needed for the secondary sector to drive that growth. Most underdeveloped countries, so of course it's key, but it's not what actually drives the growth. So most underdeveloped countries and countries with weak economies do not have a strong secondary sector. While this issue is complex, it can be boiled down to low supply of things. When there are no things for people to buy and jobs that pay enough for people to afford those things, economies do not grow. The secondary sector is the sector that produces those goods that people purchase. And then, of course, with the job creation in terms of higher wages, it makes people more money. It also produces goods to be traded, the secondary sector, which I discussed the significance of global trade on, I want to say, economic growth in episode 7, I believe. And those physical goods produced, in turn, produce large amounts of money to be added to a country's GDP. And again, due to the value-added production process, much more money than the raw materials that come from the primary sector. This is a big reason as to why underdeveloped countries and underdeveloped economies do not grow or grow very slowly because they do not have the strong secondary sector to drive that economic growth, since the reliance is on the primary sector and that does not drive economic growth. The fourth is that the secondary sector acts as a sort of a bridge to support the primary and tertiary sectors, in that it takes in the raw resources from the primary and turns those resources into usable and purchasable products for the tertiary sector. The fifth is the construction of infrastructure. And while homes and businesses are, of course, good things to build, and they're important, they do not function properly in the modern world without relevant infrastructure. Aside from things like roads being required to travel from home to work or anywhere, really, and power plants required to have both those places run, power grids, building infrastructure creates strong capital that supports future economic growth. A country with a good, strong power grid will function, hopefully, and be able to grow economically, while a country with a lackluster power grid will struggle to support itself, let alone grow. The last two here I'm going to list can again be applied to really any sector, but in more specific ways depending on which sector. So, of course, we're focused on how we apply it to the secondary sector. Number 6 here is encouraging innovation. Most innovation occurs in the quaternary sector, direct innovation, but with research and development industries. But the primary and secondary sectors are the ones that demand that innovation happen. The obvious one is a shift to technology taking over labor, things like robotics. But specifically for the secondary sector, innovation in materials and production methods are the focus, the actual methods of how these things are done. Think of carbon nanotubes. The research was, of course, not performed in the secondary sector, but it is the secondary sector that produces carbon nanotubes because the trickle-down demand from other sectors requires that the secondary sector demand that innovation from the higher sector. Hopefully that makes sense. And the processes and production methods in which carbon nanotubes are created are innovated on because the secondary sector demands it. The seventh here also goes hand in hand with driving economic growth, but I think it is specific enough and important enough to on its own to stand on its own. That is, the secondary sector improves living standards. The reason I am separating this is because I want to focus specifically on the goods produced that help raise standards of living, not just the secondary sector's role in growing GDP, which is more focused on driving economic growth. And standards of living encompass more than just a growing GDP. You can equate it more to general development. You know, things like having improved health, all those things we went over in, I believe, episode 5 was the Human Development Index. So that is things like affordable clothing, electronics, vehicles, all these things produced in the secondary sector on their own help to improve standards of living. So, as a quick recap over these 7 things, the secondary sector is important because it adds value to raw materials, it creates jobs, specifically those with higher wages, it drives economic growth, it supports other sectors and acts as an inter-sector bridge, it builds infrastructure, capital, it encourages innovation, and it raises standards of living. Moving on now to finish off this episode, let's create a sort of rough roadmap for how we are going to navigate the secondary sector. I think I'm going to start off with food processing, as I mentioned earlier, the food processing industry as a whole, and we'll go into that next episode, I think. Then I'll continue the sort of general major industries, so we'll do materials processing and the processes involved, as I mentioned earlier, and then materials refining and the processes involved there. Then I'll probably do construction, and this will be many, many episodes down the line, but I'll probably shift to construction after that, just to kind of switch it up from manufacturing. After that, I think we will take a bit of a break from secondary sector specifics and do some science episodes so we can understand some of the processes in specific industries better, just some general chemistry and physics. And this might even come right after food processing, or it might come before, I'm not sure. But I kind of want to go into at least some secondary sector specific stuff before we do more of those kind of general knowledge episodes, because we've done quite a few of those. But any oddly specific science I think we should go over will then probably be on a per episode basis. So I won't be doing like again oddly specific stuff. For example, I'm not gonna explain nuclear physics until going over nuclear power specifically. And you might think, well, why would we need to know nuclear physics, or at least the basics of nuclear physics, to understand nuclear power? Well, that's because I think it's important and I think it's very interesting. And I think we can expand this podcast just beyond explaining how the nuclear power industry works and understanding how nuclear power itself actually works. Uh, but that's just me. So I'd love some emails if you think that that's not a good idea, but I think it is. And then after those sort of science episodes, if we do them then, I think we will do a series on utility production. Water treatment being fairly simple, so we'll probably do that one first to kind of lead into it, but I have a rough plan ahead already of a long series for electricity production, as I mentioned before. After that, I'm hoping to have enough listeners, because that's a lot of episodes. I don't even know how many, but it's probably 20, 25, maybe even 30. It's going to be more than we have right now for sure. But I hope we have enough listeners to get suggestions for specific secondary industries that we may want to delve into. But if not, we'll go over random things like steel, concrete, specific things like that. And that will kind of branch out from, going over the materials processing stuff, because we'll do that kind of general stuff first, and then we'll kind of delve into specific processing of steel and concrete and things like that. And I would also like to make some episodes deep diving into how certain industrial giant countries actually manage their secondary sectors. This stuff is quite difficult to research, so we'll see how that goes. But I think it would be very interesting to, you know, understand better how, like China, especially for example, kind of manages their secondary sector and the industries within. And this is again a rough roadmap, but it at least lays out a bunch of episodes that we will be going over in the future. So it's subject to change, but I think we will at least start with food processing next, and then, like I mentioned earlier, kind of doing a mini series on it. I think that will be at least 2 episodes. I don't think there would be enough to stretch it to 3, so we'll see how that goes. But I think that about does it for what I want to discuss here. Just some general information to get us prepared for the secondary sector. So if you enjoyed this episode, I would love a positive review on Spotify or Apple or wherever you listen, any podcast aggregator. You can also email the show at fabricofindustry@gmail.com with whatever you'd like to say, even if it's just hi. You can also look at our Facebook page and give it a like, or join the Discord from there for a more active conversation. At least more active than email. And with that, I will talk to you next time.